this great big tall statue. And then he required everybody to bow down to it, and people came and brought Lashon Hara that Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah did not bow down to it, and the decree had been made that anybody who didn't bow down to it was going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. And that's where we got to, but I did it just the storyline in the Aramaic, and I didn't actually, okay, so this is good. And now that I've got everything that I need, it's being live streamed, good to go, everybody hears. And now I need to share my screen so that you can see what I'm looking at. Sorry. Okay. So we're going to look at Sefer a little bit to see some of the questions, and we're going to look at the Ramad Valli. So some of Malbim's questions and the Alshik's questions, etc. Now, some of those questions we've already asked. There's an awful lot of duplication of language. Like it tells you it, and then it tells you that they did it, and then it tells you because they did it, and each time it gives you all the details. And it's like, really, why'd you need to give me all the details? It's not like the story of Eliezer going to get Rivka, where we're told that you're supposed to learn from even the deeds of the servants of the Avot. We can learn all sorts of derech eretz. Like, who's going to be learning derech eretz from the fact that Nebuchadnezzar made a statue that he wanted everybody to bow down to, essentially like Avodah Zorah? Like, why do we have to have that repeated over and over again? It's enough to tell us once. Don't need to tell it over and over again. Okay, and so we're in chapter 3. So if you ever want to be able to see the Malbim yourself, so you open it up, go to the Sefer, you go to the verse that you're looking at, and then if you click on the dot, depending on if it's English and Hebrew or Hebrew only, it'll either be to the left or to the right, and you click on the dot, and then that opens up a whole bunch of choices, and we're going to look at the Mefarshim. And particularly, I said I was going to look at, I wanted to look at the Malbim, because the Malbim brings question after question. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of questions on the part that we've already done. And then there are some deeper questions that the Ramad Valli is going to answer for us. And if we finish that, then we'll move on with the story. So the first set of questions are, what is the matter, right? Why did Nebuchadnezzar do this at such a great expense? It was like, it took a tremendous amount of money. Okay. And he made all of the princes and nobility and officers of his kingdom to gather together to this place. It's called Bikat Dura. Okay. That they should bow down to a statue, which after all was just now made. It wasn't like, they can say, oh, this is some ancient thing. What does this have to do with worshiping? Like, what does the thing make any kind of sense? And furthermore, it has such, like, if they don't do it to be thrown into a fiery furnace, what kind of bizarre, cruel and unusual punishment kind of thing? What does this matter? So that's his first question. And he goes on and he wants to know, and what's the connection? Now, I actually already indicated, so I have a sort of one of those Baruch Shekivanti moments, because I answered it out of myself. I may have seen it last year while I was preparing, but I didn't prep it particularly for last week. What's part of the connection? The connection was, and both Malbim and the Ramad Valli bring the connection, the answer to this question is, why is this story immediately told after the story of his dream? In his dream, he also saw a statue. He saw it Tselem, okay? And it had the head of gold. Now, the one he made was entirely gold. And what had Daniel told him? That head of gold referred to him particularly, to Nebuchadnezzar, and to Babel in general. And so he went and made a statue which was entirely gold in order to sort of hint at that it's a stand-in for himself. Okay. And so I sort of said, this is related to that. So I have one of those Baruch Shekivanti moments, because that was a question that I asked. So that was a question that I answered on my own. So that always feels good when I line up with Chazal as I go along. And so then he asked, furthermore, and particularly when he had just acknowledged and announced that there is a God of all gods, right? That there's a Kadosh Baruch who establishes kings, and who uma'adeh, for those of you who are interested in language, normally in Hebrew we would say Mesir Malachim, okay? Mekim Malachim u'Mesir Malachim. He establishes kings and he removes kings, but the Ma'adeh is more, it's a Aramaic shorish here that made its way into Hebrew, but that's one of the Aramaic shorishim. This Ayin Daled Hey is an Aramaic shorish that means, among other things, it actually has a variety of meanings, but one of the meanings of that shorish is to remove something. Okay, so God establishes kings and he removes kings. And how can he now all of a sudden insist, deny what he had just acknowledged and insist that people should bow down to this statue of gold? It just doesn't make any sense. It has no, it's not alive. It's not the source of life. So what is going on? So that was the first set of questions. And then he asked additional questions. I think that was on verse 3. He had more questions. No, let me see. He has more questions. This is not putting the questions in the same. I may have to just pull out my Sefer because I hear more questions. And I think that there were other questions as well. But anyway, so here are some more questions that the Malbim asked, because we did get up to verse 12. He asked that Mem Shin often stands for Maishna. Either what's the difference or why is it taught this way about Achlu Kortsehen Di Yehudaya. So I explained that based on that I'd seen this phrase Achlu Kortsehen in the verse in Parshat Kedoshim, in chapter 19 in Vayikra. They bring as a translation, the pasuk in the Torah says something like Al telech Rachil, don't go about as a Rachil. It's with a chaf, not with a gimel. And that's from that we have this word Rachilus, which is telling stories to somebody's detriment. And the explanation in Rashi and others is that the people who go about Rachil, right, it's related to the word Ragil, that they go about by, it's like they're peddling their wares, as it were. And they go about on foot. They go from one place to another, and they achlu kortsehen. And Rashi there says that they sort of, it's like people who get invited to somebody's house, to be sort of the entertainment. And so they're the gossip celebrities, and they know all the stories, and they go about and they eat on the basis of the way that they can tell stories, So that's what I explained last week, and that's pretty much that. So Malbim also indicates, right? The implication is shehelshinu, that they said lashon hara, they were talebearing about all of the Jews. And he points out, but it wasn't about all of the Jews. So we don't know what the other Jews did. What we know is that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that's what this Rashi Tevot is it's a way of abbreviating their names. It's just the first letter of each name. And there's an even deeper question, which I don't remember that I asked, although I remember being bothered by it, which is this whole story, and we're in Sefer Daniel, this whole story, the whole chapter is about Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, which is fine, okay? They are Daniel's close friends. That what we heard at the very end of the previous chapters, that he got them appointed to jobs to help him do his job. But where is he in the story? If they didn't bow down, how much more so is it likely to be the case that Daniel himself didn't bow down? And where is he? Why is he not being thrown in? Why aren't the people who are telling the story? So I offered one answer, which is maybe they felt okay telling stories against against Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah. They felt okay to tell stories against them. Why? Because Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, after all, were not appointed by the king himself, even though in the language of Sefer Daniel, it actually says, it did say, you're the king, Samta to aim decall. You gave this rule that everybody who hears the sound of everything has to bow down. And whoever doesn't bow down is going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. And there are Jewish men that you appointed, Manita Yato, not the only Jewish man that Nebuchadnezzar appointed was Daniel. He didn't appoint Hanani, Mishael. He agreed to the appointment of them at most because Daniel appointed them to help Daniel do his job. But what the people sort of are indicating, anyway, it's a very strange set of questions here. Okay, and here we are. Right, and so here are the questions. So, right, and so the deeper question, he says, is what about Daniel? You think he would have bowed down? Where was he? That he wasn't part of this story. And also, why does it mention the fact that Nebuchadnezzar appointed them over the kingdom of Babel? Because he didn't appoint them. He appointed Daniel. He didn't appoint them. And he didn't even appoint Daniel over the entire kingdom so much as he appointed him over all of the other chachamim. All right. And ma she'ein odim lelohav ma shayach ze li'inyan hishtachavut tetzela. To say that they don't worship the gods of casting, that they don't worship the gods of Bavel. Right, they worship the god of the Jews. But what does that have to do with this tzelem? This tzelem is a new thing. And to date, we haven't heard that Nebuchadnezzar said that it was actually a god. All right. So the Malbim offers some of his own answers to these questions, but I think and his answers are interesting, but I think what I'd really rather do is switch over to sharing the Ramad Valli and to take a look at some of the things that the Ramad Valli has to say, because to my mind, they are the ones that are really amazing. Okay. So the Ramad Valli, and part of what the Ramad Valli, remember, gives a perush that goes from Shat all the way down to Sod. It's the whole Pardes. All right. And sometimes he's explaining things on the Pshat level, more often on the Drush or Remez level. And then he dives into Mamish, Sod, Kabbalistic kinds of ideas. And so the first question is, the first thing he comes to tell us is that it's known that that this particular non-Jewish king comes from a root of Tumah, not from a root of Kedusha. And so even when he submits himself to God, it doesn't last very long. It's not a deep impression. And you see it, that's what the story is telling you. So that's just on a pshat. And that answers part of the question of why the two things are related. Then he answers the question of why the previous chapter and this chapter are related. He comes back and he answers it again. Okay. And so, and he says, and this one is one of the, like I said, that was my Baruch Shekivanti moment when he heard from Daniel that he, Nebuchadnezzar, had this aspect of the head of gold. He became very proud and haughty on his high level, higher than all of the subsequent kingdoms and royalty that was going to come in the world till the end of history, right? So he felt really great about himself. And so he really wanted to make himself like a god, but he knew that people wouldn't accept that. So rather than actually making himself a god, and maybe this answers that other question that the Malbim asked, what's the business of saying he's not worshiping that these three guys, Chaim, Mishael, and Azariah, and they used their Bavli names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Either way, that they weren't worshiping the gods. In other words, they weren't worshiping Nebuchadnezzar the way Nebuchadnezzar, as it were, wanted to be worshipped. So Ramad Valli, in line with teachings of Chazal, always gives Nebuchadnezzar the quality of being a chacham. And he knows better that you don't worship someone or something which is going to die. A God has to be, right, has control over the source of life. Gods don't die. So if he acknowledges that he's human, he's got a problem with it. And so he can't really do that. So the tselem, which was entirely made of gold, was to hint at himself. And he would have, he would feel good. Oh, they're bowing down to the gold and the gold is me. And so it's really like they're, without actually starting a new religion. So that's the second answer about the connection that that the Ramad Valli gives, and that it hints at himself. And then he brings something to point out, look, he made this huge thing of gold, okay? It's 60 amma tall, 30 meters by 3 meters. That's a lot of gold. Now, he's not a fool. So I don't remember if this is his answer, if this is the Malbim's answer. It doesn't matter. He's not a fool. He's not going to impoverish himself. This tells you how much gold he had. And so the Ramad Valli says, so this is why in the Torah, there's a commandment from Hashem Yitbarach that the king should not increase, should not have and amass for himself, personally, particularly, a great deal of silver and gold. What good does it do us if it's in the if it's in the treasury and not being used? We have the opposite story from the same part of the world. Okay, Munbaz was a Persian king later on, so actually had inherited a lot of Nebuchadnezzar's wealth, and much later on. And Munbaz, in a time of famine, started opening up his treasure houses and spending the money to buy food from abroad, etc., and to distribute it properly so that the people of his kingdom should live. And his siblings and cousins and, the people who were hoping to be the king following him, etc., they said, what are you doing? All of your ancestors acquired more gold. Like they left the country, they left the kingdom richer than it was before, and you're impoverishing the kingdom. And his answer was, I'm spending something of this world and acquiring for the next world. I'm spending something which is temporal and finite and acquiring something of infinite value. And he continued doing what he did. He had a lot of pushback. He eventually converted to Judaism, by the way. But so that's a different story. That's not brought by anybody else here, but it shows us what a totally different attitude Nebuchadnezzar has. Nebuchadnezzar's not at all interested that anybody after him should inherit his wealth. And if I remember correctly, we saw in Targum Sheni to Megillat Esther that part of what happened was that Achashverosh uncovered and found a place where Nebuchadnezzar had buried a lot of his wealth, because Nebuchadnezzar didn't even want his own son to inherit from him. He wanted it just for himself and not for anybody else. That was his only way of making it permanent, as it were. And it still isn't permanent. Nothing in this world is permanent, but people get so mixed up on that. Anyway, but we do have a mitzvah. There are several mitzvot for kings. They shouldn't have a lot of wives, they shouldn't have a lot of horses, and they shouldn't have a lot of gold. And the Ramad Valli gives a reason. Now, we have to be very careful about giving reasons, because if you think you know what the reason is, and the Torah itself actually gave a reason why not to have a lot of wives, okay? And Shlomo Melech said, not a problem. I won't fall prey to that. That's for other kings. It doesn't apply to me. And then in his own way, he did end up falling prey to that. The Torah says, don't have a lot of wives because lest they turn your heart away from Hashem. And Shlomo Melech, who one of his names is Yedidya, friend of God, says, between me and nobody can come between me and God. Not a problem. I can marry as many women as I want. And Shlomo Melech, in the end, set up situations that were not, that were not good, because he transgressed against the law of the Torah. You think you know what the reason is. That's lovely. But just because you think you know what the reason is certainly does not mean that you understand all of God's calculations that are in there. So I'm just saying that before I bring you, the Ramad Valli is giving us a reason, but he's not claiming by any stretch of the imagination that this is the only reason why God made this halacha. Okay, so he makes this halacha and he says this is an example of perhaps this is right. This is an object lesson for us as to why God made that halacha, was that because of Nebuchadnezzar's great wealth, to the point that he didn't even feel it when he spent so much gold to build this 30 meter by 3 meter statue out of gold. He didn't even feel the lack of that gold because he had so much money. You know, if he had significantly less, he wouldn't have acted in such a haughty, arrogant sort of way, and he might not have fallen into this trap that excessive amount of wealth can be a trap for human beings, and make you feel like you're the master of everything and it doesn't matter. Okay. And then now, so till now, the Ramad Valli was giving us sort of shot and maybe drasha kind of level of things. And now he says, and by the way, there's a secret here, Baraza. There's a secret. Why is it 60 and 6? Right. So I'm saying it in terms of meters because that's something that we can wrap our heads around. And so I say it's 30 and 3. But amma is approximately half a meter. That's where I came up with the numbers. So, but in the story, it's 60 amma and 6 amma. And what is the notion of 6? Well, 6 is all the directions of the world, right? 7 is the internal point. 7 is the nefesh, the neshama. Okay, so 6 days you do things. It demonstrates control over your environment. And b'yom hashvi'i shavat v'yinafash. On the 7th day, God rested from exerting control, as it were, although he obviously remains in control. V'yinafash, and he ensouled it. He gave a soul to the world. That inner point of connection. And the 8th day, we know from, many of us know anyway, from various midrashim, etc., the 8th day of something is beyond. You've gotten to 7 and now it's the beyond. So the 7 is olam hazeh, including the neshama, including the nefesh that's at the center point. And it's all the directions and that resting point in the middle. And the 8th, whether it's the Yovel or whether it's the 8th day, right, for Brit Milah, or whether it's Shmini Atzeret, the 8th is something which then takes it and goes beyond to something which is eternal and Olam Haba. And so, but Nebuchadnezzar is only focused on the 6, okay? Because he did this about all to indicate that he had rulership over all the directions. That's what 6 hints at. Now, I also said to you that we know, and I've seen in Baba Batra, etc. I don't think they bring this. They even bring just things in terms of the Beit HaMikdash, that when you're putting up a wall or you're putting something up, it needs to have a certain width, okay, to support a given height. And a 1 to 10 ratio does not work, okay? 1 to 10 does not support. You can't support something on such a narrow base. So it needed something, just from engineering perspective, it's going to need something at the base of it, which is going to be much wider than just the 6 amma, to hold it in place, to provide it with stability, so that the spire, the tall statue itself will be able to be supported. And so here, Ramad Valli brings us Medrash, basically, and he says that Nebuchadnezzar took all of the gold that he had looted from Jerusalem, and he poured it at the feet of this statue in order to cause it to stand. And now the Ramad Valli says, and this is why I say this is Medrash, right? And he says this is in order to fulfill the verse that says, "V'zahavam l'nida yiyeh," and their gold will be for nida. Okay. Why? Because nida, according to Ramad Valli, hints at avodah zorah, because avodah zorah also causes tuma like nida. Now, as a woman, it's a little hard to hear if you don't stop and really think about what's going on. Okay, because but notice it doesn't say that nida is like avodah zorah. Okay. It does not say that a woman who's benida, that there's an issue that she's like something like avodah zorah. Rather, it says that avodah zorah has some characteristics to it which are similar to nida. So that's very different. You need to look at the direction of that. And let's read a little bit further. So he says, Tizrem k'mei deva. I'm sorry. The gold like will flow like the devei. What does that mean? Because the blood of the nidot are from the world of tohu. Okay, tohu vavohu is before Bereshit, right? And after the world of tohu is sort of pushed aside, then can come the world of Torah. So it just one way of understanding the world of tohu is that from creation until Abraham was tohu, from Abraham until the Mishnah basically was the world of Torah, and from then until, and we're very much in it until the end, another approximately 2,000 years to each. So that's one way to understand it in terms of parts of time. Or the other way to understand it is that the world was told, that the universe, whatever was tohu and vohu, it was chaos and formless and void, and it had no meaning and nothing. And that has to wash away like the blood of the nida comes from there. And what happens after the blood of the nida is gone and you go to the mikvah, right? Because then the Spirit of God merachefet al pnei hatahom, and the water and everything else. So then what happens is that, so then you remove the impurity of the nida, and then Emirz Hashem, then with the zivug of the couple can come a bria, can come a creation of a new soul, of a new life. All right. And similarly, there was a necessity to remove the tuma of avodah zorah in order that there could be a zivug between Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the world of Torah could come and take its place. So it's not, nida is something that can be removed. And so in that sense, the tuma of avodah zorah, which is also rooted in this place of tohu vavohu, and it's something that has to wash away and then be purified from in order that creation and creativity can take place. So too, avodah zorah has to get washed away in order that that the giving of the Torah, etc., can take place. All right. And so so you should know, he says, that, so that seems to answer my question about how do you get something which is 60 amma tall and only 6 wide, how do you get that to actually stand? And so he poured all this extra gold out at the bottom to weight it at the bottom to make it so it would stand. That seems to be, that's pretty much an Olam Hazeh kind of answer. And then the Ramad Valli says, no, there's actually something even deeper going on. And he says the thing that really keeps it standing strong was because they had placed within the mouth of the statue, the Shem HaMefurash. Now, whether that means that he had the tzitz or that he had the Urim V'Tumim, or what exactly it was that he had that he used, that he put into the mouth of this tselem, it's not clear. And that's evidently from something that Chazal had explained, because there's a verse that said, Upakadati al Baal beBavel v'hotzeti et blao mipiv. Oh no. Okay, I'm just going to say okay on that. Go away. Fine. Well, I didn't want it to be blue. Let's see if that works. So that which he got rid of that which he swallowed from its mouth. Well, I don't want it to keep on making. There it goes. It made a little square or rectangle, but anyway. And so how did Chazal explain that verse that I commanded, or I tasked, whatever, that which is not there in Bavel, to remove that which it swallowed from its mouth? The way they explain it is that Daniel removed the name which was swallowed. In other words, there was this name that was put inside the statue, and it had essentially supernatural qualities to it, that because God is eternal, and so his name is eternal and stands. And so therefore, by putting that name inside the pestle, inside the statue was able to stand. When Daniel removed the name that was swallowed into, not swallowing like you and I swallow, a glass of water or whatever, or our food, but it was placed there in the mouth part of it. When Daniel removed that which was swallowed up in this sense, right? Now it's swallowed up. My one hand is swallowed up inside the other hand. Then the statue fell down. And so now we're again, language of secret that he's revealing to us. And this is a truth that we speak about, but he's telling us this is really how the world works. That the Sitra Achra, the other place, I'm learning Tanya with one of my sisters, and so we just got through the chapter where the Alter Rebbe is first trying to define this notion of Sitra Achra. It's a place where one sees oneself as discrete and separate from God. So how can such a thing exist? And the answer is it can't exist except because there are sparks of holiness that come to it. Okay, either they're given over to it, or they're forced into it. They come under its control, because it's certainly clear that nothing from the side of the pestle itself, right, from Nebuchadnezzar's intent, there's nothing eternal, there's nothing there that's connecting to the side of Kedusha. It's all from the side of Klippa and Toma. So how could it possibly stand? How, not just sustain its existence, how could it ever stand at all, except that it has to have something within it somehow of Kedusha in order for it to have any kind of existence. And, we see things that appear in our eyes to be bad and evil. And some of them really are. And some of them, it's just a case of we didn't look at it in the right way. But the ones that really are, and we say, like, how does God let that happen? Well, sometimes there's some aspect of holiness in order for us to have free will, or because there's something which does have holiness that this evil being has control over. And so in order for the aspect of holiness to continue, okay, which it's going to, because it has an aspect of holiness, of course it's going to continue, because that makes it connected to God and connected to eternal, to eternity. So because that continues to exist, then the side of evil that has control over it will also continue to exist in its merit, as it were. Okay. But when you take away from the evil, when you take away from it these sparks of holiness, then immediately it falls, because it doesn't have anything left. It doesn't get any existence or status from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because it's not connected to that at all. So that's the Ramad Valli just on one verse, okay? Like totally, totally amazing. I'm not going to be able to go through all 12 verses, but that's in general the kind of thing that he does. So he goes on and he says that, so something else that I noticed that I wanted to touch on, what is this place Dura, right? Like, why pick Bikat Dura? So I gave an answer last week, which is based on some of the other Mefarshim, that says Dura is this valley. It's surrounded by other mountainous kinds. So there are a lot of cities in it, but it's a very flat place. And so the statue can be seen from everywhere within the valley, and it can be seen from all of the mountains, et cetera, that are surrounding the valley. And that was that on a sort of pshat level or psychology level, whatever, that was what was going on. But Ramad Valli brings us that Bikat Dura is the name of the place where Nimrod built Migdal Bavel. Okay, remember, this is Bavel. This is the same Bavel, and this is the same place. This is Eretz Shinar Bikat Dura, and it is the place where the original Kilkul, the original destruction, took place. Because what did Nimrod and the people want to do, right? They wanted to build this tower to fight against God. God had just brought the Mabul. They wanted to get control of heaven, to get control of the water faucet so that it couldn't happen again. So it was a place of Avodah Zarah to begin with. And the Ramad Valli extends an idea that I know I've mentioned in other classes somewhere, but we have this idea that nitgalgala chova b'yedei chayav, that a judgment of not this here, what it's saying. Let me explain to you. Here he says nitgalgala chova b'makom chayav, that the new sin was caused to take place in a place that had already had a sin occur there. Okay, and this Rasha, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, calculated that he would renew the original sin that had been done there in that same place. Okay. Now, there's also a notion that if there's some kind of harsh judgment, let's say, that because a chovah can either be a sin or a chovah can be a debt. Okay, and so it may be that for whatever reason, somebody can't be found guilty, etc., by a court. So then HaKadosh Baruch or the court, it could be the fault of the courts, it could be that they were really good at keeping it secret what they were doing. But whichever one it is, that we have this notion that in that case, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will balance the scales. And he balances the scales by causing something bad to happen to them so that they pay the debt that they owe. All right. And now the question is, how does that come about, right? Is it going to come about by means of the tzaddik? Or is it going to, because it's carrying out justice, so maybe it should happen at the hands of the tzaddik? But we had this notion about nitgalgala chova b'yedei chayav, that no, HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes somebody who's already guilty of something, and he causes this other essentially bad thing, right? Taking payment of somebody's life or their belongings or whatever, causes it to happen by means of somebody who's already guilty, either in this lifetime or in some previous lifetime. I am not saying or suggesting that if you see that there was some kind of an accident, that you should question the purity in this lifetime of the person who caused the accident. Okay? Because it could be really and truly like such a total accident. We have a story in my family, and I'm not going to tell over the story, but there's a story in my extended family where something like that happened. And I will tell you that there's not a single person who thought that the person who caused the accident was guilty of anything at all, ever in her entire lifetime. All right. And so, but I will also tell you that having to live with the guilt, it could be that she came into this world and there needed to be a tikkun for something that had happened in some previous lifetime, and that she basically got it all straight. But there still needed to be some final cleaning up of the mess, as it were, so that she could be done. And so this happened by means of her, and then she didn't have to pay. It was so totally a seen as an accident, almost as an accident that couldn't have been prevented. But but she had to live with it for the rest of her life. And she had to figure out how to still be able to be besimcha and not to fall into depression and not to throw away the rest of her life. And that work that she had to do. So Chazal would say, that it's this idea that nitgalgala chova b'makom chayav, or nitgalgala chova b'yedei chayav, that there was something, if not in this lifetime, in a previous lifetime, and because this happened at her hands, it caused her such pain that it allowed her to clean up every last little bit. I don't wish that kind of pain on anyone, right? I don't wish that on anybody. And Chazal themselves, as well as people who aren't at that level, try to do our best to avoid having anything bad happen at our hands. Right? We don't want the responsibility for somebody else's pain. If they have to be caused pain, It needs to not be at my hands. There's a verse, we're not going to be there for a while, about having to put up a railing around your roof, lest the one who falls will fall. So Chazal say, if he's going to fall anyway, what's my responsibility in the act? And again, they say, it doesn't have to be at your hands. Okay, you need to do what you can do. You want to put yourself in a position where God chooses you to be his messenger for good things that happen to people, and not choose you to be his messenger for bad things that happen to people. And so you want to put into place everything that you can to prevent bad things from happening in your home as a result of something that you've said or done. And you want to make yourself open so that if an opportunity comes your way to do something good for somebody else, that you can do that. But so that particular phrase right here had just sort of grabbed my eye. This phrase about, and this is really a basis in Jewish thought. Okay. And then, so it's interesting. I really did. I expected that Malbim would ask, why are we saying the same thing over and over again? Right? We're given this whole list of everybody who shows up. Right? The officers and the governors and the financial officers and all these different people, we were given this whole long list. He called to them. And then when they came, he made an announcement to them. And then later on, when the fanfare came, they all bowed down. So there are a couple of questions that can be asked on that. And I expected Malbim, who is frequently the person who asks, why does it appear that there's this duplication, to be the one who would ask it. But in fact, it was Ramad Valli who asks it. And he says, why, it could have just said, So the first thing he says is, first he sent to gather all different kinds of officers and rulers, etc., that were in all the various different kingdoms, that they should come in order to inaugurate this worship of this particular statue in this place. And by means of that, he figured that would aggrandize, it would make even greater the kavod, etc. All right. So that's what he says. But then, stop. Whatever. Okay. I'm just going to leave it with a blur on the side of the page, right? But then he says, okay, fine. So that's why we understand why it tells us the whole list of why he called all those people together. But we now have other questions. What need was there to go and to say it over again 2 verses later? It could have just said, instead of saying Badain mitkanshin, so then they all came. But that's what it could have said, right? It could have just said Badain kula mitkanshin, they all came. But instead, it goes through the list a second time. And so he says, it wants to hint, right? I told you, Ramad Valli gives us pardes. So this time it's at the level of a hint. It wants to hint by that not a single one of them was missing. You say kula, right? Kula, we also say there's a sort of halachic principle, rubo kukulo, the majority of it is like the whole thing. Okay, the majority is like everything. So if you just say all of them came, that could really mean most of them came. But if you list off each and every one, it means nobody was missing. Okay? So that was the next hint level that he gave. And they're all standing opposite the Talmud. They're all waiting for the command of the king. What's he going to say? And so then he causes there to be this announcement that was announced in a great voice that all of the nations and all of the peoples and all of the languages who are standing there. So that's a little weird, okay? Because it's, at the moment, it isn't everybody. It's just the officers. And so now the question comes up even stronger. Like, we understand that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah should have been implicated because clearly they were among the officers because Daniel had appointed them there. But Daniel himself is an officer of the king. So where is he in this picture? Okay, so that just like strengthens the question that we had before. Where is he? Right. And the other thing that gets repeated over and over and over again, like at least 3, if not 4 times, is the description of all of the different kinds of instruments that were being played in order to make this, this fanfare to tell people that it was time to bow down. Okay. And so the Ramad Valli says, it's interesting. Kama mine zemer shehitkein. Let's look at how many different kinds of instruments did he appoint? Okay, in order, and why? And so one thing is, and it's so interesting how everything sort of comes together. Music touches the heart. I just heard a lecture a week ago about somebody who is dealing with the halachot of how do you paskin for various questions that come up with regard to people who have mental disturbance, whether it's psychosis or anxiety or whatever level you are. And he said that one of the most common questions he gets is there a way that I can listen to music on Shabbos? And he said that in many times, not only is his answer to them, you may, but his answer to them is you must. All right? Because when you're in some bad mental state and you're just cycling deeper and deeper and deeper into it, sometimes listening to music can help remove it. I'm not suggesting anybody should paskin for themselves, but you should know that, and then the bigger deal is, and I'm not sure to what extent Rav Yoni actually makes sure to say this to people, but then you have to deal with the fact that somebody, hears, oh, I have to be Mechal Shabbat. And why? It means God doesn't love me. God doesn't want me. He doesn't want my Shabbos. Like, how horrible would that be? Like, you're fixing one problem and making it worse in some way. And so you need to make clear to the person, just like somebody who needs for physical reasons to eat on Yom Kippur, somebody with anorexia needs to eat full-out meals on Yom Kippur, just like any other day. And it does not mean that they're a bad Jew, and it doesn't mean that God doesn't accept their service. Somebody who has to eat on Yom Kippur, it's not a question of a heter, it's a question of, it's a chiyuv, right? It's a chiyuv. You must do this. And what does the you must do this mean? It means today, this is what God wants. This is your avodat Hashem. This is your service to God. And your service to God may be with the, but we know that music, and anyway, so that was one thing that I heard within the last week about the issue of music and service to God and how music affects the person. And because music can essentially take you out of yourself. And he said, he always checks. He says to somebody, okay, so you've been feeling really bad and you think that music is going to help. And clearly, because you're asking me, you're not yet listening to music. What are you doing instead? And if the instead is something serious, which it often is, because he kept saying, there's no vacuum. There's no vacuum. They have to deal with it. They're in such pain. They have to deal with it. If the way that they're dealing with it is either potentially in the long run life-threatening, or is potentially or absolutely a bigger problem with respect to Shabbat, then the answer is there are ways to be listening to music that are perfectly fine. But it's not only that. For instance, where do we learn that listening to music in Tanakh? Where do we learn that listening to music changes, can change your mental and emotional and spiritual state? So we see that David was brought to Shaul, okay, because he knew how to play music, because Shaul was suffering from melancholy. And we see that the Nevi'im sometimes, and the B'nai Nevi'im sometimes, in order to bring them, they had to be in a state of simcha to be able to be a fit vessel for Nevuah. And so they had to listen to the proper kinds of music to be able to change their mental and spiritual state. So and why was there music in the Beit HaMikdash? Okay, so there's so much about music. But beyond that, okay, but unfortunately, right, music can also go to a place of klipa. It's not only going to a place of kedusha. It's not only that it becomes part of our service to Hashem, but it can go to a place of klipa also. And so he says here that he did this in order to cause all of the hearts to cleave to, right, to become connected to this new foreign service in all its various dimensions, because there's nothing that draws the heart so much as music and nigun. Okay, and he says, right, just as we had in our Beit HaMikdash, we had Meshorerim and Manginim, singers, and people played instruments in order to draw the hearts close in a pure kind of devekut. So here he had all these kinds of instruments in order to draw the hearts close in an impure kind of clinging. Okay, because the Sitra Achra also goes after the minhagim of Kedusha. Like he says, like a monkey copies people. Okay, it's a kind of chikui, it's a kind of imitation. And so just as it works in Kedusha, so everything in Kedusha has a false copy, as it were, in the other side. All right. I think I've gotten almost up to an hour, and I don't know if there are only two people who are actually listening live, I think. But the question is there anybody who wants to listen to Rabbi Hachbam's class? He's giving a class on tefillah and stuff, and particularly relating it to the tzom, the Aseret B'Tevet. So if there's anybody who wants to go listen to that class, I'm going to stop now. Otherwise, I'll keep going for just a little bit more. No. Okay, fine. So then I will keep going for a little bit longer, but then I need to daven my own mincha because the sun is going away here in Yerushalayim, and we're coming close to the end of the fast. And so I need to be done. That's why I moved it up earlier. So and then he goes on and he says, like, why was it necessary to announce the punishment of this fiery furnace? Again, seeing as everybody's there. Like, what? He thinks that there are people who are there who aren't going to bow down along with everybody else. Like, and it's the second time. It's again, right? It's this business of why is he repeating and repeating? Okay. So the Ramad Valli offers us an answer that it would not have occurred to me. Okay. And so I think this is it, either from the level of Medrash or from the level of Sod. He says you should know that this announcement of this particular punishment was placed by heaven into the king's heart in order to test the tzaddikim, who were the friends of Daniel, in order to see if they would stand firm in their emunah and if they would be willing to be moser nefesh. Now, this whole story is a big question, and I heard other people talking. Where did I hear it? Heard it in Daf Yomi within the last couple of days. It is so truly amazing to me how everything always comes together. It's like everything I'm about to teach, either immediately after I teach it or immediately before I teach it, I learn it in some totally other context. There is a big question about being willing, right? Because yesterday we had a siyum on the Masechet of Masechet Tanit. And in Tanit, there are a whole bunch of stories that are brought, and some of them are somewhat problematic because they seem to indicate that people do things trusting that their great merits will save them from difficulty. And then there are other voices in the Gemara that say you should never trust that you're going to be saved because of your merits, and that anybody who trusts that they're going to be saved because of their merits, a miracle will not happen for them. The miracles only happen when you're not expecting it to happen. When you expect it to happen, it won't work. Okay? So, and they brought up this story, our story of Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah. Like, so one way to solve the problem is exactly what we're going to hear. We haven't read those verses yet, but Nebuchadnezzar is going to give them an opportunity sort of to explain themselves. And then he taunts them at some point, and he says to them something on the order of, what, you think your God is going to save you from this furnace? And their answer to him is God can, but whether he does or not is up to him. We absolutely believe that God can. And it's because of those verses that we haven't gotten to yet. That's sort of where Ramad Valli is perhaps coming from. It's to see whether they can do that. And actually, God knows that they can, right? This is like on the order of God Nisa at Abraham. God tested Abraham. And one explanation of God's testing Abraham is that he wasn't testing Abraham to see what Abraham would do. He was testing Abraham in order to show Abraham what he was capable of. Okay. In addition to teaching Sefer Daniel and Gemara and some other things, I also teach math. And I do my best as a math teacher not to test my students until I know that they can pass the test, because I want to show them that they can succeed. I do all sorts of other things along the way to help them build up the strength to be able to succeed. Okay. But I don't actually want to give them a test that has, consequences for their grade, etc., until I know that they can do it. And that's the same order of God testing Abraham. The word nes or nisayon has to do with lifting a banner, lihitnoses, okay, to lift up a banner. God tests Abraham in order to show Abraham and in order to show the world, okay, how how much Abraham is capable of, right? There's one of the Mishnayot and Pirkei Avot, many of which Mishnayot are among my favorites, but this particular one I really love. It's the one that says, God did this, and why did he do it? There was an extra element of love there. Not only did he test Abraham, but he let him know that God chose us, God gave us this, that, or the other thing. And above and beyond that, he let us know what's going on. That knowing, okay, is an extra level of love from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to us, that we're not stumbling around in the dark. And so to test these tzaddikim, God knew what the answer was going to be. Why? He doesn't know. Of course he knew, but it's not only to test them, it's to test them to show themselves what they are capable of. God believes in us. Do we believe in ourselves? Right? So God tests them in that sense. And above and beyond that, it's also because we're going to hear at the end of the chapter, there's a great miracle, not just the miracle that they come out from the fiery furnace alive, etc., but there are miracles that happen before everybody who's there to see it, right? It's like the Romans with their amphitheaters, and they had all of these violent types of fighting and whatever between people and animals, between somebody who had almost nothing with which to fight and somebody who had full armor and everything. Very unequal kinds of, first of all, it's bad enough to use a fight as something that you as entertainment value. But in these cases, it wasn't just like a fight. It wasn't a fight that you could tap out and say, okay, I quit, he wins. It was fights to the death and cruel. And so it's going to be that we're going to see, it's going to be the same sort of scene. Everybody's there to see them burnt to a crisp. And this great miracle takes place. And so that's the other reason, okay, that God put it in mind, so that he could do the big miracle that he knew he was intending to do, even though they correctly say to Nebuchadnezzar, God's capable, but whether he does it or not, that's not our calculation. We're not counting on that. What he does is what he does. We're doing what we have to do. Okay. And then it says this business about everybody bows and down except for, so it's interesting. Ramad Valli says everybody bows down, etc., except for the fourth tzaddikim. He says Daniel's there and Daniel also doesn't bow down. And so now our question is a different question. Daniel's not part of our story. If Daniel's there and he also doesn't bow down, why didn't they indicate to the king that Daniel also? So an answer on the level very much of Pshat is that everybody knew that Daniel was a favorite of the king. So they didn't want to say to the king, Daniel didn't do this. The king might find a reason to excuse Daniel, and say, well, I had everybody bow down to Daniel. Why should Daniel have? There are all sorts of ways the king could have kind of gotten out of it. So they figured that they could get at Daniel by hurting his friends. And then that would sort of put the what's the right word? I just lost my English. And the fact that I haven't had anything to drink since last night is not making it easier for me. It's like sometimes the tide seems to be going in favor of one side, and sometimes the tide seems to be going in favor of the other side. Chazal tell us that you should never start up with somebody that the mazal is favoring him. Okay. If you see that somebody is being successful, that's the time to just sit back and wait. When the tide turns, as it were, when the wheel turns, and it's no longer the case that he's being favored, then if you have to have a court case with him, if you have to do something, that's the time to take after him, but not at a time when his star is in the ascendant. So just a pshat kind of answer as to why Daniel is not mentioned in the story is that they were afraid that if they mentioned Daniel, that the king would find a reason to excuse Daniel. And once he excuses Daniel, he's going to have to excuse Daniel's friends also. But if they just leave Daniel out of the picture, the king doesn't really owe anything to Daniel's friends. And so, or he doesn't have the same kind of connection with them as he has to Daniel himself. And so that would be why they left Daniel out, because we see at least, and the Ramad Valli doesn't make these things up. So if he says that Daniel also didn't bow down, so that's one answer. Okay, there's another answer. Which ties this to a story in a different place, which is that Daniel, at the time that this whole thing was taking place, Daniel was on a mission for the king, and he was nowhere near Bikat Dura. So he wasn't there. And he didn't hear the original announcement, and he didn't hear the fanfare, and so he wasn't part of the story. So there are two different answers for us as to what happened. But here we see the Ramad Valli says that these four were the only ones, and not the rest of the Jews either, by the way. Okay, because why? Because really, even though it talked about all of the people, the Amin, the Umot, and the Lashonim, it really wasn't everybody. It was the rulers of each of these categories that were there. Because, as the Ramad Valli told us, and others also, right, is that the king is trying to show his power over all of these high-class people. And it's more honor to him if they're the ones who are bowing down. What does he need the hoi polloi really for? Eventually, the hoi polloi are also going to have to do it, although that gets ended because of the miracle that ends up being done for Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay. So, all right. I'm going to call it, now I really am going to call it quits, because now I've gone on for like an hour, and I've gone on a little bit more than my hour. So I'm going to call it quits. I don't know that I'm going to do all the rest of verses 8 through 12, bit by bit with Ramad Valli. I may do some of it, and we're going to make the story go on. And I've already taken away some of that, just in case you didn't know this story, right? But like I said, these are, for many of us, these are childhood stories. All these stories from Sefer Daniel are stories that we know. And so I don't really feel like I'm giving so much away by hinting at what's coming up, coming attractions. So that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing. Do you have anything to say? Any questions about anything that was brought up today? Okay, so I see you shaking your head, and you need to turn your microphone on if you want me to actually hear you. Okay, all I see is the hand motions, Bajamira. There it is.
It was wonderful. It's very good explanation, and it's something I know Daniel from other shirim, but it's a completely different view of the story. It's very, very interesting to listen.
Oh, Ramad, yes. I have great Hakarat Tov to Ida's daughter, Yehuda, who introduced me to the Ramad Valli. Not that I understand everything from the Ramad Valli by a long shot, but I have great Hakarat Tov that I was introduced to that. And and that it's available on HebrewBooks.org. I have great Hakarat Tov to Chabad for putting that library out there on the internet for us. And so, a lot of Hakarat Tov all the way around.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so if there aren't any questions, then we're gonna call it quits. A good end of the fast. It should be meaningful in all sorts of